Hey, welcome to Flight Test. I'm Josh, and today we're going to be showing you how to build the Mini Speedster from our Mighty Mini series. Now, if you haven't seen the Mini Speedster, it's a wonderful plane for flying indoors, outdoors, and in a small backyard. It also operates off of a small 250 size motor and a 2-cell battery, which gives you lots of performance for a very low cost. If you haven't already, download the free plans, or go ahead and support us by going to our store and getting the Speedboat kit. If you haven't already, make sure you build your power pod. The power pod is going to be the key point of the electronics that goes in. Now, it's considerably smaller than our current power pods on our swappable series, and there's a separate video that'll walk you through how to put it together. Get your materials in order and we'll get started. The first thing we're going to start with is the wings. I'm going to go ahead and pop this out. Now, a cool little tip here is if you have the Speedboat kit, go ahead and tape the bag to the side of the table. This can work as your waste bag and saves you a lot of mess later. Now, the wing is one of the biggest but yet the easiest things to put together on this kit. To start with the wing, make sure you have your barbecue skier and your wing tips and your center plate, along with these little camber gauges and your dihedral gauge. Once you have that, take your barbecue skier and with the blunt end, go ahead and open up this little score cut here. Now, if you're scratch building, the score cut is indicated by a red line, cut through is by a black line, and indications for creases or reference marks are blue lines. So as you're cutting this out, just keep that in mind. If you see a red line, you're going to want to do a 50% score cut with your razor blade. Go ahead and groove all three of these here. Don't push down and go through the paper on the bottom. All we simply want to do is open up a cavity so this will easily rock up. Make sure you have these two gauges here to give you the proper airfoil, and make sure they slide up and it doesn't push down too hard. If it pushes down too hard, when you remove this, it's going to sag and go back. So if you have to, just open up a little bit. Once you're happy, go ahead and put a bead of glue. I like to start about 1/4 inch from the edge and finish 1/4 inch from the edge. We're using the AdTech Pro 200 hot glue gun. Had a lot of really good luck with that. Now, we're going to lift this up. We're going to place the 2 wing gauges here on both sides. And then we're going to take a scrap piece of foam while we're holding this down. These on both edges. We're just going to scrape off the excess. Extra glue is not extra strength, it's just extra weight. Now we're going to keep even pressure on this whole entire wing piece while it dries. Make sure your gauges are as far left and right as possible on the wing. That'll give you a nice true wing when it dries. It's very important that this portion of the wing here sits nice and flat. Once it's thoroughly dry, repeat the same process with the wingtips. Now that our wing panels are thoroughly dry, you're going to notice that they all carry the same angle and the same shape. You'll notice in this area here that there's an actual bevel cut in this wing. That's so when you rock this up into place, you get dihedral. But you just don't want to do this by your eyeball. You want to use a gauge here. This gauge here will fit right into the bend of the wing. Once you're happy and you see that it fits good, let's go ahead and glue it down. Now to glue this, we're going to go ahead and put the glue on the outer panel of the wing. You can put it on the inside or the outside, but we're going to favor most of it towards the top here because gravity is going to let it pull towards the bottom. Lining up our leading and trailing edge. We're going to go ahead and line this up, and then we're going to rotate this up, and you can see that I kind of let this paper, especially on the Speedboat kits with a little bit of undercut, cup right around the wing piece. Makes a very nice clean joint. And once it's a start, I can go ahead and just take this little guy here and go ahead and smear this glue down right into that joint. We're going to come back later and use tape and more glue and reinforce it. We're going to repeat the exact same process on the other side. Now that our wing's glued together, we're going to go back with some hot glue and a scrap piece of foam, and we're going to go ahead and reinforce this on the top and the bottom, and then wrap it with tape. Make sure you have your wing gauge handy, because when you put the hot glue on the current dried hot glue, it can soften and change a little bit. So do this one side at a time. Now that the hot glue is dried, I'm going to go back with some Scotch tape. I'm going to go ahead and just reinforce it. Just going to start at the back trailing edge here, split the difference between the two. You can use box tape if you want, or some colored tape if you want a nice pinstripe down the side here. Wrap it around, follow up, remove the excess. We're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. At this point, your wing is now done. It's time to move on to the fuselage. Now the fuselage is very simple to build, especially if this is one of your first or second airplanes. Now if you've never built one of our designs before, you know that we fold our pieces together. We don't actually have side cheeks that glue butt up against it. We use the paper as our friend and we use it as a hinge point to fold things together. Because of that, we have 2 types of folds. We have an A fold and a B fold. Now if you've already built your power pod, which you probably have, the A fold is where the side cheeks are above the bottom plate. The B fold is where the side cheeks are besides the bottom plate. And if it ever confuses you, just simply look very closely at the diagram in here. But in order to get that kind of a fold, we got to remove some material. That material is going to be these 2 guys on the side of the fuselage right here. Now that's oftentimes also going to be indicated by a red score cut. So going back to your plans, if you're scratch building this, those red score cuts, you're going to simply crack this out, open it, and remove it. Now if you're scratch building, this can sometimes tear off in a couple pieces. So rather than going ahead and having it be a mess, just simply glide over a couple more times, get as close to the paper as possible. Even on the speed build kits, I oftentimes will do this just to get a very nice clean break. You want this cavity to be as clean and square as possible. We're going to do this process on the other 3 portions here. Once you're happy, now we're ready to fold. But before we do that, on our plans and also on our speed build kit, you'll see this blue, little etch line right here. This etch line is an indication of a crease that you want to make. Now because this crease is on a very small fuselage, oftentimes I'll lay a ruler or even a razor blade right up against that line, just so I have something giving me a little bit of pressure. And now I'm going to go ahead and raise this up, probably about 45-degree angle, just so it doesn't fight me. Now is the point where we're going to go ahead and fold up our 2 fuselage sides. To do this, we're simply going to go ahead and place a bead, and because this is a B fold, a B being that the side cheeks are besides the bottom plate, we're going to fold this, and we're going to keep the bottom plate against the table as we move the side cheeks up, pressing against the table. And if you look closely at the indication, you'll see that the etch marks indicates just that. So if you have any questions, always look at the etch marks on your plans or on your kit. So we're going to practice this move, make sure we hit nice and perpendicular. We're going to also use our little dihedral gauge that we saved to make sure we stay square. Once you're happy with that movement, place most of your glue where the side cheek is going to meet it. And that's going to be on the side of the bottom plate. I like to stop just a little bit short and begin a little bit short at the beginning and the end so glue doesn't squeeze out and glue itself to the table. More glue doesn't mean more strength, so take your time on this. You don't have to use a lot. Always make sure you go back and check and make sure you're 90 degrees. Alright, at this point we're going to go ahead and repeat the next side. Once again, we're putting the majority of our glue on the side of the bottom plate. And if you notice, I'm keeping this back end here off the table ever so slightly. That's so this little tab here doesn't get damaged and also doesn't change the angle of our fuselage. Fold it 90 degrees. Keeping that downward pressure, using the table as your friend to get you a nice clean right angle. You don't want to try to make this fold. Check this for 90. You don't want to make this fold up in the air off of the table. If you do so, you can get it crooked, and that's going to mess up the angle of your stabilizer and your rudder. Now we're going to go ahead and finish off where our landing gear is going to mount, and that's going to be by putting glue on both sides of the bottom plate of the landing gear. To get B folds, we focus mainly on the sides of the bottom plate. A folds, we focus on the sides of the side plates. Fold this over. Move some of that excess. You can use a scrap piece of foam if you don't want to burn your fingers. And then upside down, firmly on the table, using our right angle as a reference. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut the bevels into our stabilizer and our rudder here. To establish this crack, I'm simply going to fold this over. Now normally we put our bevel cut on the side of the elevator, but in this case, because that area is so thin, we don't want to compromise it at all, and we don't want to put any weighted popsicle skewers like we've done in the past. So we're going to actually cut our bevel cut on the opposite side. And there's 2 different ways we can do this. The one is with the razor blade. Now if you're going to do it with the razor blade, first make sure that your hands are clear from the hinge line and clear from the razor blade as you pull it through. And also, don't hold your razor blade perpendicular to your foam. Hold it in a nice gradual angle and make sure your razor blade's nice and sharp. Now if you notice, I'm focusing on keeping this razor blade just shy on the other side of the hinge line. You don't want to be cutting through your hinge line and onto the other side of the foam. Once you go ahead and do that, your finger is a guide. And we're simply going to pull nice and steady. Straight towards us. Now at this point, if your foam doesn't cut all the way down to that hinge line, you can go back over and over again until you get it just perfect. If you cut through it, don't worry. All you simply need to do is put a little piece of tape on there and it's good as new. Now, that's one method. The other method is simply to take a sanding block, and this is for all you that don't like to handle razor blades close to your fingers, which sometimes I don't. Hold it off the edge of the table. And with a few swipes, you get the exact same result, just a little bit more messy. For this one, we're going to put our bevel cut on the side of the rudder. This is your fin, and this is your rudder. We're going to fold 90 degrees. This time, go ahead and use the table as your friend. To do that, simply hold this down. This is really good for pieces that are too small to hold with your hand. Once again, if you have to go over it to make it right, you don't want this portion to be bound because the small servos we use don't like it. Now at this point, this does work just fine as a control surface, but over time and over crashes, it's going to go ahead and start delaminating. So one thing we can do to fix that problem is simply by putting a bead of hot glue down the middle and scraping off the excess. Now I want to stress that you want to get as much hot glue off after you put it on as possible. All this is simply going to do is fuse the paper, the foam, and the hinge all together so it makes a nice durable joint. We're going to put a thin ribbon of glue right down the center. It doesn't have to be a lot because we're going to be scraping a lot off. Now take your scrap piece of foam and scrape as much off as you can. Careful not to break your foam or get too aggressive with it. Take off as much as you can like you're brushing and thinning out paint. Now don't close this joint, let it thoroughly dry while it's open. We're going to repeat the exact same process on the rudder. Nozzle right down against the center paper there. Really thin bead, and you'll notice I'm not doing both sides at once, I'm just doing one side. If you get a little on the excess, don't worry. Scrape off as much as you can. Once these are thoroughly dry, we're going to go ahead and put it against the table. Check for movement. It's going to be a little bit stiff. Go ahead and loosen up with your hand using the table as your friend, making sure that this flows nice and free. If it's difficult, it's going to be difficult for the servos as well. At this point, we're going to go ahead and remove these extra little blocks of foam. If you're scratch building this, these probably don't exist at all at this moment. Pop those out. I like to fold this bottom piece back a little bit and slide it in. Make sure you're happy with the fit, and always keep that little gauge ready to make sure you can check for making sure it's perpendicular. The more times you check this, the better your plan's going to be built. Once you're happy with the fit, let's go ahead and apply a little bit of glue and glue it in. We can go back later and reinforce this. This is mostly just to tack it, but if you notice here, I'm putting this glue here so it smears away from the hinge line and goes to where we want it to go. A little hot there. I'm going to go ahead and just hold this there until it thoroughly dries. At this point, we're ready to test fit the fuselage and the tail surfaces together. It's always good to do a test fit before gluing, just to make sure you're used to the motion and that you have no fit issues. For this, I'm simply going to slide the keel of the rudder through the fuselage, and I'm going to pull it up until the tabs line up in the fuselage. Do one tab at a time. Once that's put together, go ahead and use our little tool. Check and make sure it's perpendicular. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of glue on both these portions here. Always be strategic about what pieces you put the glue on. You don't want to drag your piece through the glue. We're going to go back afterwards and reinforce this. It's just to hold it in place and make a stronger glue joint. Slide it back. One tab in. The other tab in. Now we go for making sure it's perpendicular. Once this is dried, we're going to go ahead and open this up a little bit with our thumb, and we're going to put a little tiny drop of hot glue on both sides of the rudder. Press it down, and of course, we go back to make sure it's perpendicular. Now that everything's perpendicular and solid, we're just going to go ahead and get a little bit of reinforcement glue on both sides, and then use a scrap piece of foam to smear off the excess. Extra glue, especially by the tail, can cause nothing but problems. Once the glue is dry, we're going to install the formers for our fuselage. Now we got a bigger one and a smaller one, and the bigger one's going to go in the rear slot. So if you haven't already, open up these little holes, quick test fit. Once you're happy, little drops of glue, and pop them right on in. Make sure they're centered with the fuselage and flush on both sides. If it's a little bit off because you hand cut it, no worries, just center up the best you can. Paper is going to cover this portion anyway. Once the formers are thoroughly dried, we're going to go ahead and install our turtle deck in our front cockpit area here. Now to do this, if you notice when the angle the paper hits here, it's going to raise off the front leading edge here. So we're just simply going to take a knife or a piece of sandpaper, and we're going to simply cut a bevel right in the top here. It doesn't have to be perfect. All we're trying to do is remove some meat so the paper will sit nice and flat when it makes that angle. Once you're happy with that, We're going to go ahead and find just by eyeball the center. Now if it's a kit, you'll see a little tiny paper tear right in the center. We're going to apply 2 drops. Let me see if I can do this in reverse here for you. We're going to apply 2 little drops of hot glue. Now this is just simply going to be to tack and keep the paper nice and straight. 2 little drops there. We can even do one at the very peak right here. And all we're going to do is sit this down in here, center it up the best of our abilities. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. And we're going to let it dry for about a minute or so. While this is drying, let's talk about paper real quick. Paper has a grain to it. Just like on a block of wood, it's easier to bend with some grains than others. In this case, the grain is going this way, and this is how you want to cut it out on your plans. If you try to bend it against the grain, what you're going to get is wrinkly paper. In this case, with the grain going this way, it's much easier to bend it nice and sharp for our fuselage than if we try to bend it this way. This way here will give you lots of different creases, and you don't want that. Now that this is thoroughly dry, let's go ahead and practice here before we put glue down and make it permanent. All we're simply going to do is we're simply going to fold the paper over top of the turtle deck, just like so. Make sure that you have no problems, no fit issues. At this point, if say something is crooked, it's much easier to pop those 3 little joints off and do the whole process over again than going ahead and ruin up this step. You want to make this portion as fluid as possible. Once you're happy with that and everything's bent well, we're going to come back and trim this out later. We're going to go one side at a time. Make sure you have full stock of glue. Keep your nozzle pushed up against the foam board. Now if you want to practice this on scrap, go ahead and do that. Right up against, all the way as high as possible. See, I got a little bit of excess in there, not to be worried. Now I'm going to fold this down, not using too much pressure, just using my fingers to hold it firmly against the fuselage. We're going to hold it there until it's thoroughly dry. Now we're going to repeat the process on the other side. Once again, keeping our glue nozzle or our glue ribbon as close to that top end as possible so it doesn't squeeze out below. Just a little bit, no big deal. The important thing is you don't want big glue globs going everywhere. And you can notice there that we didn't put any glue on the former. We're just mostly pushing down to let it meet up against the former nice and tight. It's because this model is so tiny and that has no strength whatsoever to offer you. It's just simply form. Now at this point we can either use a razor blade or a nice sharp pair of scissors. If you're going to use a razor blade, make sure it's nice and sharp. On some forms we can actually trace the inside, just like so. Just do that a couple times over until it finally pierces through. Or we can actually use the light shining through. Simply stab through the foam and very carefully keep that blade flat up against that rear former as we move around. You don't need to do this in one shot. You can take little niblets at it. And come back and make it prettier. Now this edge for right here, all I'm going to do is simply make a couple little swipes. I'm not going to try to go all the way through. And it'll pop right off. This way you can be a little off. No turtle deck is the exact same, but you get a nice clean fit every time. We're going to repeat the exact same process on the front, but this time you'll notice that there's a little tiny notch here. Go ahead and take a razor blade or a straight edge. Just go ahead and make your little fold and curl that 90 degrees. That little fold that you see is going to friction fit just a slight touch tight right here. And that's going to help center up this whole piece of paper right here. Once you're happy with that fit, just a little bit of glue on the front. Use that same ribbon technique that we talked about. Let it thoroughly dry. Now the glue is thoroughly dry, we're going to repeat the exact same process on the front here. Once again, just fold it down and up towards the front. Use a little bit more pinch pressure just to start establishing a little bit of a crease on both sides here. Makes your job a lot easier. Then follow that back around, and you see if you do it right, it's going to meet flush with those ends right here. Once you're happy with that, we're going to go ahead and choose one side. Put our thin little ribbon of glue down. You're welcome to put glue on the bulkhead if you want to. I don't bother just to keep down on weight. Keep it simple. And at this point, if you want to use a table as your friend, you can. I'm not putting excessive force down here to crinkle the foam. I'm just putting a nice constant steady force The more you work with foam, the more comfortable you'll get with what that force is. Use the force. I laughed within my own head.
You laughed outside your own head, too.
Oh, sorry. Repeat the same process on the other side. Once both sides are done, you're going to notice that you have this little extra flange here. Simply take where your razor blade was cut. Go back maybe about 1 millimeter. Just do the exact same process as you did before. Get a very nice clean fit. You can even take just a little drop of hot glue, smear it over and hold it down, and it makes it one. At this point, we're ready for electronics. Now, if you haven't done so already, go ahead and remove these scraps right here that allow your wing to slide through. Reason being is we want to make sure when we're installing our servos that we're not blocking this hole with anything. We're going to have our servos located in this area, and we don't want our servos to drop down too low and keep the wing from passing through. Now, for these models, we highly recommend that you use 5 gram or lower, but there's no reason to go down into the sub-micros, the 2.5 grams, etc. Those are far too fragile, and you want these to be able to take a beating and still control everything. We have tested these on the 9 gram servos. They work wonderfully, but they do add a considerable amount of weight, and you will feel it in your flying. But if it's a backyard flyer and you're having fun and this is all you have, by all means use it. Just make sure when you install your servo that they're as far forward as possible, but they don't pass through where the wing's going to be passing through. You got to make sure that it's back far enough that your electronics won't interrupt the wing passing through there. So for that reason, we're going to go ahead and use 5 gram servos. That's what I highly recommend. They're still very durable, they're still very easy to maintain, and they're just small enough that they'll fit in here without too many issues. Now, because every 5 gram servo, and every servo for that matter, has different hardware, you're going to want to be careful with this. And rather than saying how many holes out to cut your servo control horn, I'm just going to go ahead and give you a reference measurement. Basically, about 1 centimeter out. So pick out the control horn that can give you that. In that case, it's going to be this guy right here. And remove everything that you don't need. Now, you can do this with scissors, side cuts, or just rocking your razor blade and taking your time and cracking it. We're looking for about 1/4 inch, or I think that would be about 7 millimeters from the center. You don't need an extraordinary amount of throw on these planes. If your control horns are too long, they're going to collide with the servo on the other side and give you problems. And the last thing is I don't need that outer hole. I'm going to go ahead and remove it, but I'm not going to cut so close to the inner hole. I'm going to go right down the middle, a little rocking motion. Just like that. This doesn't have to be exact, it can be a little bit further out. Just make sure before you go ahead and go too much further that you test fit it and it's not too close to your control surfaces. Now, it's very important if you don't have a servo center that you use your current radio gear and make sure your servos are properly centered before installing them. Once they're installed, it's going to be very hard to center them rather than doing it now. Now for this, I'm using this really cool little Hobby King guy. I got a little battery fastened to it. Let's go and plug this in. All you need to simply do, plug your servo through. We can check the throws, or we can hit a button and center it up. Now, there we go. If your servo is like this and you try to install it, you're going to have to try to get down into your fuselage, unscrew the screw, and change everything over. It's a lot easier to have it centered up ahead of time. Once you're happy with this, go ahead and lock it down with the screw ahead of time. Makes life a lot easier. Now that our servos are all centered up, before we glue them in, we're going to go ahead and install our control horns. Now, because of this being plywood, I don't want to strip any of the layers, but we wanted to keep this all together. Just drag your razor blade right over top of it. That way it comes apart nice and neat. This is a good tip whether you're building a scratch build or a kit of any manufacturer. Always look at their tabs, and if you want a nice clean finish, just drag over the blade just a little bit. Now in the kit we have these push rods. These are 0.039 inch wire, and the hole will receive the push rod just like so. Let's go ahead and pre-install these guys. Now to open up these grooves here, take your barbecue skewer and pass it through, pointing in first, just so your push rods don't bind on this. Now you're going to notice here, as we pass this through, there's a simple groove cut into the foam. We're simply going to press this down through and open up that groove. Make sure that we have no binding and no issues, and then it moves freely. Once you're happy with the push rod still installed, you don't want to leave this off. Go ahead and put a little drop of glue down. On our bigger planes, we use linkage stoppers and we pass the push rods through afterwards. We do it this way to save on weight and keep things simple. It also keeps you from putting your control horns in backwards. Go back again, make sure we're happy with the throw. We're going to repeat the exact same process with the elevator now. At this point, we're going to go ahead and prepare our servos. Now for this, you want to take time once again to make sure your wing does not get blocked from passing through the fuselage. So keep in mind where you're putting this, but you do want to bring it as far forward towards the center of gravity, which on this wing is right by the CG. So we want to move the servos as far forward as we possibly can, closest to the CG without blocking that cavity. The smaller your servos, the further forward you can go. Once you're in this area here, it doesn't really matter nearly as much. But if you install your servos back towards the tail, you're going to have to compensate with a lot of weight. That being said, these push rods are going to cross each other, just like so. Now one tool, if you guys don't have already, I'd highly recommend you getting is a pair of Z-benders. We can have a link down below. Lots of different manufacturers making them. If not, you can bend them with pliers. You just got to do one bend at a time, and you got to have very strong, rigid pliers to do it well. That being said, we're going to go ahead and take these as far forward as possible. And looking at where the servo goes, this is about the point where I can move it forward. So I'm going to take my finger, I'm going to go just ahead of that, and I'm going to cut these guys right now. You don't have to get these exactly right, because we're just going to glue them where they center. Now at this point, we're ready to go ahead and install our servos, but we do need to do a Z-bend. We're simply going to take our Z-bend pliers, bend them down, take our servo, pass it through the servo arm. A little rotational force will help. And at this point, we're going to go ahead and do a practice run to make sure everything is good. I'm simply going to let this fall towards the bottom. Keep in mind you're going to have to use your fingers on both sides. I want to make sure when this is fully down, this is neutral, that this area is clean and can pass straight through. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and take this up. It's not a bad idea to take a little bit of sandpaper, scuff up this area, because the glue is going to be holding on it, and this plastic is quite fatty, which means oily, and oily doesn't stick well. Once we have that, a little bit of glue, drop it down in, and then repeat that process so we're centering up your servo. This is why it's so important to center your servos ahead of time. Now we can simply drop that in. We can keep an eye on our tail surface, get it nice and flat, and let it dry. We're going to repeat the exact same process on the other side. Once again, we have a Z-bend. Install our centered push servo screw. Drop it in for a test fit. This is where it gets a little bit tight. If for some reason you bump your servo and it goes out of center, make sure you recenter it before moving on. That looks good. There's no collisions. We'll go ahead and glue it in. Now I'm going to hold it in place until it's thoroughly dried. At this point, you now have perfectly centered servos with no linkage stoppers, no extra hardware, and minimum amount of weight. Now if we haven't already, we're going to go ahead and remove this area here. This is nothing more than an access hole for your servos and a way to inspect and see if everything is okay. Now for your wing, before we pass it through, it's not a bad idea to just go ahead and give it a little bit of a pinch right on this leading edge. That's going to be the edge that passes through everything. It'll keep it from flaying up and peeling off the foam. Now we don't ever want to force the foam board. We're just going to use a rocking motion. It's a little bit annoying and a little bit loud. Let's see, we're passing through. At this point, we're going to go ahead and use the table as our friend. Little tiny rocking motions. Careful when you get around the dihedral portion. Just a little bit of resistance. You can kind of go back here and you can help it out a little bit. if you built a larger plane, or if you built a larger old Speedster, you'll note that the wings were actually slightly off-center to allow for the thrust angle issues. With this model here, we actually have the thrust angle designed into the power pod. The reason we didn't do that on all the other planes with our swappable series is some did not need thrust angle issues and it would actually screw up the design. So in that case, we actually offset the wing. This one, you'll be happy to know, is perfectly centered and the thrust is in the motor. The thrust angle is in the motor. So we're going to line this up. An easy reference is this cavity is cut perfectly to the size. There we are. Now is a good time to go ahead and make sure that your tail surfaces and your wing are perfectly parallel to each other. Simply do that by sighting the leading edge of your tail, the leading edge of your wing to the leading edge of your tail, and check and make sure they're level. You can also go back with your gauge and check and make sure that's perpendicular to the fuselage. Once you're happy, it's your choice. You can glue the wing down. We oftentimes let our wings free float. That way, if you do take a sharp hit and you cartwheel, the wing moves and it doesn't destroy anything. Now's the point to go ahead and put our attention towards the wheels and the landing gear. But before we do, if you wish, we actually include in the kit and on the plans these cute little wheel pants. Now, one cool thing about those classic 30s through 50s air racers, they had very large, oversized, cartoony looking wheel pants. We wanted to go ahead and include that in this kit. So to go ahead and do this, we got two folds. We have an A fold and a B fold. A is where the side cheeks go above the plate, and B is where it goes besides. If you look closely, you'll see that's just what's illustrated in these little pictures here. But first, let's start by removing the foam cavity here. You can always go back, especially if you're scratch building. There's a lot of really tighty cuts. Just go ahead and go back, glide right over top, so your foam comes out in one piece. There we are. Our first step is going to be for this little A fold, just like the picture. We're going to go ahead and use a table as our friend on the bottom plate, and we're going to fold up the side plate above the bottom plate. Just a little tiny drop of glue is all you need. These are really tiny. If you built the big Speedster, this should be very comfortable for you. Once that's done, we're going to go ahead and put our attention towards the side plates, and this time we're going to put glue on both pieces here. And now we're going to use the table as our friend again. If you ever have it where the glue squirts out a little bit and glues it, don't go ahead and pull straight up. Rotate or pull away. That'll keep it from ripping the paper and hurting your piece. Also works really good on model airplanes built out of balsa wood too. Last step. Same process on the other side. Table as your friend. Hold it, push down against the table, remove any excess. Now this is simply decorative. We do love the way it looks, but it does not affect the way the plane flies. You can fly this plane without a landing gear. It is a very durable landing gear, but if you are flying in the grass and you don't want to tear up your landing gear, you can go ahead and forget about this step. Now these are dry, I'm going to go ahead and remove this excess here. You can use sandpaper or a razor blade. Just cut that little bevel off as you see it right here. And different from our larger scale wheel pants, we're actually going to go ahead and bend this out of foam. Most of the time when you see a cavity the size of the foam thickness, that means you're going to be removing it. Let's go ahead and cut this piece here. Now this piece here is going to go ahead and bend and cover up the whole entire wheel pan. We're going to go ahead and remove the paper on the thin side right here. Once we do this, we can actually form the foam board with our fingers very easily. Because these wheel pants are going to be taking a tremendous amount of beating, I decided to make these out of foam, like our previous bigger version, instead of poster board. Now we kind of put a pre-curl to this. On the side that has the paper, we're going to use that to go ahead and fasten and keep everything nice and straight and true. Just like that. But rather than trying to get it all in once, I'm simply going to put a little bit of glue, and we'll just go ahead and put it on the piece itself. Slide this down, only worrying about fastening the paper and using the table as our friend. Once the paper is firmly fastened, you got a nice little hinge here. We can go ahead and put our hot glue on both seams. Be careful not to burn your fingers during this process. Just stop just short of the edge. And if you notice here, I'm focusing my hot glue mostly on the foam and letting it squeeze over on the paper. At this point now, we can actually rock it against the table all the way back, and we're going to hold it at this point here until it's thoroughly dry. I made the paper on the relief just a little bit wider than the actual wheel pants. That way you can go back later and trim it or have a nice covered edge. Now that our wheel pants are all done, it's time to move on to the landing gear. Now in the kit, we give you a 15.5 inch, I think it's 0.063 inch diameter landing gear wire. It's very light and very easy to use, but it's longer than what we need. But before we go ahead and cut it to size, we're going to go ahead and work from the middle out. So half of 15.5 inches is 7 3/4. As far as centimeters goes, half of 40 is 20. Now we're going to go ahead and bend this, and we're going to bend it to about a 60-degree angle. We're going to want to bend this in a way that 2 inches out at the 2-inch point or the 5-centimeter point, it's the same width as the inside of the fuselage, and kind of open it up till just at that point right there. Once it's there, that should be the 2-inch mark or 5 centimeters. We're going to go ahead and bend 90 degrees down. Now at this point, it's not more important to worry about measurements, it's more important to match up both sides. We're going to repeat this exact same size, so if you measure this and it's not 2 inches or 5 centimeters, follow whatever measurement that is. That's the one you want to follow. In this case, it is 2 inches, so we're going to repeat it on the other side. It's very important that you go ahead and do one side and then the other. Don't try to complete the whole side of the landing gear and go back. Makes life a lot easier, because now we can go ahead and twist and bend and get everything uniform. Little subtle tweaks, that's all you need to do. For the vertical leg of our landing gear, it's going to be 2 inches or 5 centimeters once again. And this time, we're going to be bending the axle. Going to go back, confirm our measurement, still 2 inches. If it's a little off, say it's 1 3/4 inches, this side now becomes 1 3/4. But in this case, it's 2 inches, so I'll simply go over here. Landing gears are one of the most complicated things on planes because it's very difficult to get them straight. Doing this off the plane and using the table to make sure things like your axles, you can see that's bent a little bit crooked, are nice and flat. It makes it a lot easier. Little subtle bends. At this point, we can actually make our foam wheels included in the kit. But if you want something a little bit more durable, these are available at most hobby stores and soon to come to our store once our order arrives. But in the kit, because we don't want to leave anyone without wheels, we actually included these little guys right here. These are not going to last you forever, but they do give you something to roll on. But to show you how to make these, we're simply going to take this coffee stir. We're going to go ahead and with the twisting motion, pass it on through. If you have to open up just a little bit, go ahead with your barbecue skewer. And do this with 2 of your discs. Don't worry about the little flanges here. Now if you're scratch building this, it's very difficult to get a perfectly round circle. I'd highly recommend that you just simply go to your hobby store or go online and order them. Laser Toys, Hobby King, all the great little hobby shops have them. You can get them for about $1 or $2. With these both on, I'm simply going to put a little ribbon of glue, a little drop in the center. I'm going to go ahead and bring this top down, and I'm going to smush them together, let all that glue go down. I'm going to line up the edges. Now I can go ahead and take a little bit of scrap, smear this smooth. Once you're happy with that, simply cut it about 1 millimeter on each side. You now have a finished wheel. Now for this model, because we're going to be going to an indoor flying event, I'm going to go ahead and use these wheels instead. Now in your kit, you're going to see a small piece of foam that's just a simple rectangle. All we need to simply do is take this and center it right on top. You go ahead and press down firmly. It's more important that the landing gear is perpendicular to the far leading edge here than that your bend is perfect. But if you can see there, we have an indent now on both sides. Now go ahead and take your razor blade and follow over that. Don't cut completely through, just do a 50% score cut. I'm going to take our barbecue skewer, we're going to go ahead and open this up. Now with our cavity opened up, force some hot glue down inside this. And with the same motion that we just practiced, press the landing gear down and all the way through. You can then go back and reinforce the area with a little bit more hot glue. And go ahead and smear it with a scrap piece of foam. At this point, we're ready to install this. Let's go ahead and do a test fit though first. The motion we're going to want to follow, we're going to slide this down underneath, all the way back, use our finger, pinch it together. Once we're happy with the fit and the look, go ahead and put some glue on and do it final. Once again, you do not need to put the landing gear on. It definitely makes the plane look a little bit better. But if you leave it off, make sure that you balance the plane properly, because this does add a little bit of the weight in front of the CG, and you're going to want to compensate with your battery position. Now we're ready to put on our wheel pants and our landing gear. Now depending on what you chose, I'm going to go ahead and choose these guys. Before we put this on, I'm going to go ahead and go back and cut this down a little bit later. There we go. I'm just going to start this through, put our wheel in, and then finish it off. Before I glue this in, I'm going to do the other side. Now you can see right now the wheel pants are kind of droopy. To make these really solid and really firm, take the pointy end of your barbecue skewer, and with it sitting on the table, simply make a scratch mark, ride it right along about 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters up along the edge. We're going to use that reference line to go ahead and put a score cut through the first piece of foam. Don't go all the way through, just go to the other side of the paper. This is going to go ahead and give us the ability now to push this landing gear into the foam and establish the proper angle for the wheel pants. Once you're happy with that angle, put a little drop of glue right over that slot that you just cut, and slide it right in. Use a scrap piece of foam, smear it over, and set it back on the table to dry. Our wheel pants are now done. We're ready to put our power pod in to make our connections. Now, if you guys haven't already built this, we have a separate link for our power pod and the assembly of it. Make sure that you have roughly a 250 size motor or a 10-gram motor, maybe robbed from something that you maybe have crashed, like a Beast or a Yak or something like that. But our favorite motor power plant is a 250. But before that, if you don't have this built, build it, come back to this step. We're going to go ahead, and because this is a 3-channel, our aileron function is our rudder function. So we're going to go ahead and take our aileron servo, and we're going to plug this into our aileron. Now this is a mystery to you. We go in greater depth on hooking up your electronics in our electronics power pod video. We'll link that below. It's for the larger power pod, but the hookup, the checking to make sure your motor runs right, centering your servos, all that is covered for you. We're going to go ahead and make our last connection. Keeping in mind where the signal wires are going, we're going to keep all the signal wires on the proper side. Oftentimes on little receivers, you'll have a ground, a power, and a signal. The signal is oftentimes your white or yellow wire. Ground is almost always brown or black. We can now go ahead and tuck this in. I'm actually going to go ahead and tuck my receiver in the very bottom. Pull it through. I'm going to let my ESC rest on this bottom area right here, just to give it plenty of ventilation. You don't want to glue your ESC up in this area because it'll get no ventilation, and even if it's properly propped, you need those things to breathe. Now one thing you may notice is the power pod does not have any holes cut into it. That's because since everyone uses different motors, it's hard to tell where it's going to end up. But what we did give you was some reference holes that you can poke through. But rather than just jabbing the control or the barbecue skewer all the way through, go ahead and push it all the way up against the top plate here. Make sure your motor spins freely and it's where you want it. And then with a little twisting motion, go ahead and pop through. Now instead of going through the other way, we're going to carefully go here. If it ends up getting moved, just go back and make sure you're lined up. Pop through the other side. Now a little trick for you. If you want to cut this without it splintering, go ahead and find out your dimensions. I'm going to cut it a little bit long because we have a little engine detail we're going to put in here. So I'm going to cut it roughly about 3 inches. Go ahead and simply lay your razor blade down. Roll it. That breaks all the fibers. Cuts nice and clean. Go ahead and do that one more time with the same size. We can pass this all the way through now. I personally like the little Speedsters flying nice and clean. But because oftentimes back in the golden era, they have engines extruding from the outside, one thing I included on the kit for the Scout and the Speedster was a little engine detail. If you want to put this on, you simply can stack them together, put them on the skewers, glue it when they line up, and paint them if you want. At this point, our power pod's hooked up, our receiver's hooked up. The next thing to do is connect the battery, make sure all of our control throws go the right direction. Always make sure you power on your transmitter first. And if there is any centering needed to be done, go ahead and do it at this point. You want to make sure that your up is up, your down is down. It's also very important that your battery is going to establish your CG. Now in this case I'm using the 900 milliamp 2-cell. That's about as big as you want to go with this model. But because it's a little bit windy outside, I want to go ahead and go with that. Let's get that all the way up in the front nose. Just like so. Now at this point it's very important to check for proper CG. If the plane's not balanced well, it doesn't matter how perfectly you built it, it's not going to fly well. So for that, we oftentimes include little reference marks here and here. We're going to go ahead and put our fingers under here, and we want the plane to be slightly nose down, just a touch, when you hold onto the CG marks. Now because it's on the camber of the wing, a really cool little trick you can do to make it a little bit rubbery is just put a little drop of glue over each CG mark. A wonderful gentleman at Flite Fest showed me this. Another gentleman I met put little BBs in there. Nice thing is it gives you something that your fingers can feel, and it's a little bit grippy so it doesn't slide off. Now that everything's connected properly, our left and right and up and down are proper, we're going to go ahead and check our control throws. Now, in the kit we have a low and a high throw gauge. This is roughly 16 degrees. We're going to go ahead and simply lay this up against the control surface. And when we deflect the control surface, this should come up and meet it. If it doesn't meet it, go ahead and adjust it until it does. Do this on both the elevator and the rudder. Alright, at this point we're ready to maiden. If you have any wind, make sure you're always pointing into the wind, and always go over your checklist one last time. How's that? Friends, I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank you for being part of the Flite Test community, and I want to thank you for taking time to build one of these. I challenge you, build one of these with your friends, build one of these with your kids, make a memory, and have a great time doing it. See you next time.